So I understand you're reading Aren't I a Woman? Is that it? Yeah. So I'm not going to talk about it. I mean, I am, in a sort of way. What I'm really going to talk about, though, is not just what's in the book, and you can certainly ask me any questions that's in the book, but I'm going to talk about the history of the book. Because although this is a senior citizens lecture, and I count myself a senior citizen, at least that's the fares that I pay on New Jersey Transit. And I'm not lying either. So, but there are people in this room who might not remember a time when there was no African American history. And certainly there was no African American women's history. And there certainly were no people in the university who looked like me. And so while Aren't I a Woman has had, it is groundbreaking and it's called seminal, and I'm ranked as a pioneer and all of that, it wasn't always that way. And the fact that you can read this book is a testimony to, what can I say, my chutzpah, my perseverance, and a lot of pain and agony along the way. So while I will talk some about what's in the book, and certainly, as I said, you can ask me about anything that's in it, today I want to take a look, or I want to talk about the state of the historical profession in the 70s and 80s, because I think it's important for you to have the context of the book as well as the content. History doesn't just get written in a vacuum, and often the history that historians write grows out of a particular moment in time. So that subject of my book today is, if I had to title this talk, and I will, hold on, seniors will be familiar with a postnasal drip issue, right? It's not a cold, it's just a constant whatever. So when this book was published, both myself and the book was what I call matter out of place, a term developed by an anthropologist named Cynthia Fordham, and she uses the term to refer to black women who are capable and competent, women who excel at what they do, but who don't fit the ever-changing, demeaning, stereotypical boxes that have been constructed for us by a number of people in America. To be matter out of place is to be a disquieting disruption of convention. In many ways, Fordham's term and her uses for it reverberates in the question, aren't I a woman? Putting aside for a moment the question of the origin of the speech, and I don't know if you are a historian, there is a lot of debate over whether or not Sojourner Truth actually uttered the words at this convention, but I'm not going to go there. But putting aside that question, Sojourner Truth's appearance and her elegance and her intelligence at the 1851 convention at which she spoke contradicted everything that the conventioneers thought black women to be in 1851. So much so that she had to plead for recognition of her womanhood. And in the process, she gave a reasoned account of how black women could be black and female at the same time. At a later convention, she had to bare her breast just to prove that she was in fact a woman. In both cases, she was not where or what white and male society wanted her to be. She was an intervention of the status quo. She was matter out of place. And so was this book, Aren't I a Woman? When Aren't I a Woman was in its dissertation stage and then in its manuscript form, it was not a welcomed addition to the literature on slavery. Indeed, for a very long time, it too was matter out of place. So some of you are too young to remember what it was like during the 1970s and 80s, when the fields of African American history and studies and women's history and studies were being formed. These fields grew out of grassroots movements, and they were not exactly welcomed in the academy. The fields and the scholars associated with them were matter out of place. Consider, for example, the titles of some of the articles that were written in these fields. Historian Eugene Genovese's 1969 Atlantic Monthly article was entitled, quote, Black Studies, because this was the very beginning of the field. Black Studies, quote, trouble ahead. And historian John Blasingame wrote a piece entitled, quote, Black Studies, an Intellectual Crisis. Historian Nell Painter's piece, written 10 years later in 1982, entitled, quote, Who Decides What is History? Suggested the contested nature of the terrain. This was a time of great debate over the legitimacy of African American history and also of black faculty. It was a time when a new crop of black scholars, myself included, and in fact you could hardly call it a crop since that implies plenitude, and truth be told, there was only a sprinkling of university-trained African American academics before this. We had to justify our very existence because unlike white scholars, especially historians, it wasn't taken for granted that we could be objective, quote unquote, and write history, quote unquote, dispassionately, because that's what historians are supposed to do. Indeed, we were cautioned by one of our very own, John Blasingame, against writing myth. Quote, even while recognizing the Negro's need for increased self-respect and contribution that history can make to this, young black scholars, he warned, quote, must be constantly aware of the relation between means and ends. Instead of becoming a propagandist, the young scholar, counseled Blasingame, must live up to the historical tradition created and maintained by the likes of, among others, William Wells Brown, W.E.B. Du Bois, Rayford Logan, John Hope Franklin, some very esteemed black scholars. As if we had to be told, Blasingame reminded us of Charles Wesley's warning that there could be no unreliability, no mythical or legendary basis for our interpretation. You might think about today's controversy over facts, right? We were being told back then that we had to be careful lest we were writing myth as opposed to fact. And if on the one hand, Blasingame warned us against advocacy and propaganda, Vincent Harding, another eminent black male historian, schooled us on the responsibilities to the black community. So he told us we had to do something totally different. What we owed the black community could never be sufficiently repaid, he claimed. We had to remember that we were not made by the universities that gave us our degrees, but that we were made by black people, the black community, and we had in our writing and speaking to, quote, affirm the people, celebrate the people, to clarify all those elements of their life that have been built through the pain of the land, all those elements of their life that have been built on a new way of life, unquote. According to Harding, even as we strove to gain acceptance in academic circles, as we strove to gain professional credentials, as we tried to get tenure and the like, we couldn't forget our sources. Not the hard, cold data that we collect, but we couldn't forget our people. Our responsibility as scholars to the black scholar was, quote, to work out new concepts, try to set afoot a new woman and a new man, unquote. As did Harding, our job, he insisted, was to, quote, sing for the people from which we came. So, you know, we had it on both sides. One piece of people group saying to us younger scholars, you've got to, you know, you can't have no fake facts. On the other hand, Harding is saying, do what you can to sing for the people. So, as Blassingame and Harding's advice suggests, a virtual storm engulfed the 1970s black historian and graduate student. Besides the issue of advocacy, celebratory history, professionalism versus nationalism, other issues swirled around us. Were black studies departments legitimate? Was black studies itself a legitimate area of study? What was the role of the historian in black studies? How culpable were white historians in the stereotyping of African Americans, in the discrimination and racism that blacks regularly faced? Could white historians do black history? Could black historians do anything but black history? Could black historians achieve legitimacy as historians writing black history, or did we have to prove our mettle by first researching and writing some other subject? And even today, when you say, oh, well, you know, what is your field? Well, I do African American history. Some people say, oh, you know, oh, what you don't really do real history. Would white historians lose their jobs in order to make a place for black historians? Would universities wind up lowering their standards by adopting black studies programs? And would these programs become centers of mayhem, disrupting the academy at every turn? For every reference to historian, we could place the term sociologist, economist, political scientist. You know, if you were black and if you were doing anything but, you know, anything that had to do with black people, you were really suspect. To hear some scholars discuss our problems, you'd swear that we scholars of the 1970s were schizophrenic. Because the word dilemma was constantly used to characterize both the profession and the scholar. Quote, "The Dilemma of the American Negro Scholar" was the title of John Hope Franklin's influential essays. Quote, "On the Dilemma of Scholarship in Afro-American History" was the title of a chapter in August Meyer and Elliot Rudwitz's controversial Black History and the Historical Profession. Constance Carroll entitled her contribution to the book, "All the Men Are Black, All the Women Are White, But Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women Studies." She titled her article, quote, "Three's a Crowd, the Dilemma of the Black Woman in Higher Education." And of being black and female, there might have well have been a posted sign, "Matter out of place." As both black and women's studies departments suited up, the controversy came fast and furious. Would women's studies steal the resources, the attention that rightfully belonged to black studies? Since women weren't really minorities and didn't have a similar history of oppression, many black scholars protested the creation of women's studies departments and expected black women scholars to join in that protest. Many demanded that black women scholars choose one or the other. Others questioned the wisdom of further fragmenting history, afraid that the big picture of the American nation would be lost. And not facetiously, the question was asked, what about white men? Shouldn't they have their own departments? How much fragmentation could the field of history take? And how marginal did one really want to be? Someone like myself, doing black women's history, could find herself so far in the outer circle that the center was not even visible. There was a reason for the title of Gloria Hull's, Patricia Scott, and Barbara Smith's book, All the Men Are Black, All the Women Are White, but Some of Us Are Brave. According to Constance Carroll, who in 1982 was president of Indian Valley College in Novato, California, a 1968 survey of doctoral and professional degrees conferred by black colleges, which in those days still granted most of the degrees that black professionals received, HBCUs, 91% were awarded to black men, and 9% went to black women. At Carroll's own university, the University of Pittsburgh, in 1982, white men constituted 50% of the professors at the associate and full level. Black men were 31%, white women were 19%, and black women, 3%. In other words, in those days, as it still is, the academy was a lonely place for black women. For Constance Carroll, there was no one with whom to share experiences and gain support, no one with whom to identify, no one on whom she could model herself. It took a great deal of psychological strength for her to just get through the day. In fact, her formula for surviving was to tell herself over and over, quote, "You must be better qualified than the men. You must be more articulate. You must be more aggressive. You have to have more stamina to face the inevitable setbacks. You must have more patience, since you will advance more slowly. Above all, you must remain feminine and not appear threatening." Carroll was not atypical. The joint appointments, meaning that you're in two departments, and I'm in two departments, as I was mentioned, I'm in history now and women and gender studies. But as joint appointments became popular, it was not uncommon for black female professors to find themselves the only black person in a traditional discipline and the only female in a black studies department. When racism marked the former and sexism raged in the latter, the only thing left for the African American female professor to be was, as Hull, Scott, and Smith suggested, brave. It was in this climate that this book, Aren't I a Woman, was written and published. If ever there was matter out of place, Aren't I a Woman was it. It was an uphill struggle to research and write it and get it published. In the 1970s, it was not, as it is today, a maxim that black women are difficult subjects for research because they did not and still do not leave the so-called traditional written sources. I mean, how could black women leave traditional written sources when it was against the law for black women or black people, period, to learn how to read and write. So how do you do this kind of history? How do you find out what they thought, what they did? I couldn't go to letters and diaries left by enslaved women. Written by white planters and overseers, plantation records also proved a difficult source for black women. The WPA narratives, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with these, but WPA stands for Works Progress Administration. It was during the New Deal. In order for particularly for writers and other like sociologists, etc., for them to be employed, the government paid people to go south and even mostly south and interview people who had been born in slavery, because during the Depression in the 1930s, you still had a lot of people. They were elderly, they were in their 60s and 70s, and they had only been born during slavery. But nevertheless, there are volumes and volumes and volumes of these, if anyone is interested in reading them, of people who came out of slavery and who narrated their lives to people during the New Deal, to writers and other professionals who went around and said, "Can I have your story?" Now, these, in essence, are some of the only sources that we have. I mean, there are others, you know, that are in archives. So, you know, the Freedmen's Bureau records, there are other kinds of records that you can go to. But remember, I didn't know where those were. There was no roadmap. I had no mentors. There was no history that I could follow that had been written. I'm just trying to find out where are the black women? Where are black plantation women? So I went to the WPA narratives, and they yielded the most information. Yet I was repeatedly scolded for using them, for they were assumed to be invalid, in part because they were black sources, even though they came through the narration and recording of white recorders. Although I explained to my dissertation committee and anybody who would listen that my reading of plantation records rendered enslaved women invisible, useless in a study that looked at slavery through black women's eyes, I was chastised for being lazy, and the paucity of plantation records in my sources was offered as evidence of my laziness. In retrospect, the criticism puts me in mind of enslaved women who, after working from dawn to dusk, were described as lazy shirkers of work. In reality, I was being told that by relying so heavily on the WPA narratives, the black sources, I was taking the easy way out, that I was shirking the hard work presented by the traditional white sources. The fact is that I had spent over a year with plantation records and other traditional sources, and it was like getting blood from a stone. I took this criticism as a personal assault without seeing the larger political picture. Encoded in the criticism was a piercing message. Enslaved women had been invisible in the historical record, and I was being told that to make them visible, I would have to abide by the rules and regulations of those who had rendered them invisible in the first place. I was being told that enslaved women's voices, as they came through the WPA narratives, would not be heard unless filtered through white and male-authored sieves. I was being told that my objectivity was suspect because I was a black woman doing black women's history. And underneath all the critiques of the innumerable problems, quote unquote, that existed with the WPA narratives, as if they are the only sources of slavery that presented problems. Trust me, I can show you every single source on slavery that has some problem with it. But underneath all of this was the message that, hey, you're just a lousy historian. In retrospect, it was good that I took this criticism personally. Had I seen myself at the intersection of racist and sexist gatekeeping, I might have seen the barriers as insurmountable, the Goliath as unslayable. But I was foolish, and I did the typical female thing. I internalized the criticism. I promised to do better. I went back to the drawing board and rewrote again and again. Truth be told, what became this book that you're reading, it got better, because I could not leave not one stone unturned. But it was a painful process because I was rewriting against critiques that alleged that I had not done enough work in the proper sources, and I knew I could spend a lifetime and still not be able to do what was being demanded. It was painful because I was rewriting without a language that expressed the interdependence of race and gender. Now we have what we call the language of intersectionality. And we can talk about, how race and gender intersect with each other, so that you just can't talk about black, if you're a black woman, or about black women, without factoring in that gender makes for different experiences of blackness. But who knew that then? This is before all of the many, many works that we have now. And I was also rewriting without guidance from anyone. I was doing this all by myself because no one had done this before. And I was also writing in a climate that at best was benevolent disinterest, and on the other side was just general hostility. Because remember, there was all this concern about whether or not black history was, quote unquote, legitimate. In any case, the rejections came fast and furious. A date in November 1977 had been set for my dissertation defense, but at the 11th hour, 3 weeks before the defense, my dissertation was rejected. I was devastated. I had never failed at anything. I had not always done well in everything, but I had not totally failed. As I say, I like to think that I had even passed advanced placement calculus in high school. I went to high school. I'm, by the way, a native New Yorker. I went to high school at Julia Richmond High School here in New York. My hair turned gray. Large clumps fell out. And for the most part, I kept this rejection to myself. How could I tell my family and friends that after all these years of schooling that I had failed, that I wasn't good enough? And everybody was wanting to know, why are you doing a degree in history anyhow? You're not going to be able to make a living with it. Or what is it good for? Still, with a tip from a very smart historian who sent me to the burgeoning anthropological literature on women, I rewrote the dissertation manuscript, and it was accepted fully a year later. I won't even talk about, I had a job that was dependent on me getting my degree, and I didn't get it, so I went to them on bended knee. Please, please, please. They didn't fire me. They kept me on for another year, and I became an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee after the dissertation was passed. I told almost no one about this. Nor did I let escape the fact that most of the articles that I sent out kept coming back. The very first articles that I sent out had to do about the Plantation Mammy, that whole Jezebel and Mammy chapter that you read, that opens the book. And it was rejected, 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 rejected. Very few people knew about the serial rejection of the book manuscript. The reaction of some of my first colleagues to my study was also very memorable. I had a joint appointment in history and Afro-American studies, a situation designated to create schizophrenia if one didn't already suffer from it. The male faculty in the history department told me point blank that I would never get tenure with this dissertation, with this book. When I first got there, they advised me to scrap it, to find another topic about which to write a book and get tenure with a new subject. In the African American Studies department, my work was summarily dismissed. When I told the chair, a black male, what I was working on, he rubbed his chin, he frowned, and then he lightened up and smiled, and I thought he had found reason to appreciate my work. His response was disheartening. Quote, "Oh, I guess that will be useful. Black women need to learn how to raise black men for the 21st century." Unquote. I did get some encouragement during the next 6 years, mostly from women historians. My female colleagues were incredibly supportive. Put it in another envelope and put another stamp on it, said Margot Anderson. At one point, I was invited to a series of conferences by this professor who was setting up some kind of project on black women. At the first meeting, I was asked to give a paper, but was among the last to speak. At first, I was upset because I was near the end, but the feeling evaporated as I heard so many of those who spoke before me testify to the source problem inherent in doing black women's history. It was the first confirmation that I was not wrong about the source problem. This conference was part of the Black Women in the Middle West project, which was part of an effort to address the source problem. Besides getting affirmation about the problem of sources that I had encountered, I spied for the very first time that ever rarest of species, a black female professor, a living, breathing, functioning black female professor by the name of Darlene Heim. She was the first of species I had laid eyes on, and I was ecstatic, like sorcerers, like, wow, there really are, there's another person doing this. Anyhow, for the most part, the 6 years after I finished the dissertation were survived in unbelievable anguish. I had 2 articles published, one in the Journal of Family History, the other one in the Journal of Caribbean Studies, but 2 articles do not tenure make. I needed a book. The critiques were universally the same for 6 years. It was not complete. There was not enough work. The proof wasn't there. And then almost universally, publishers added, "There's no audience for this book." What do they mean? Nobody wants this in the historical record? Black women's history is not interesting enough for people to pay for it? Black women, black people don't read? Nobody will believe this because it's about black women coming from a black woman? Was it just about making money? I wish I had queried this more. This is where a more savvy political consciousness might have proved helpful. I was not a quote-unquote feminist scholar out to make a feminist point. I was just a poor little black girl trying to get a PhD. To make a long story short, I was up against the tenure wall. With every year, the tick-tock of the tenure clock pounded ever more loudly. I studied for the LSATs thinking, hey, I can make more money as a lawyer anyhow. And then checking myself, I thought, yeah, how much can a civil rights or public interest lawyer really make? I had even scheduled an interview with the Nuclear Regulatory Administration. A friend of mine had gotten me an interview because I knew I was not going to be an academic. I prepared for the end of my life as an academic. And then everything changed, just like that. I was walking across campus. This is the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. My assistant professorship slipping away with every step. And while walking, I opened a letter that had come from North Carolina. I had carried it around for a couple of days, shoring up my defenses for another rejection. Where the courage came from that day, I don't know, but it was really cold and really dreary, and it must have been the adrenaline that propelled me from one end of the campus to the other that gave me the courage to open this by now crumpled letter. I froze in my tracks as I read. For so long I had been told that I was wrong, that I had begun to believe it. But there, right in front of me in black and white print, was a letter that said I was right. It was from Anne Farrar Scott. She is today known as the mother of women's history. She explained that she and Jacqueline Hall, another professor, were writing a review essay in Black women's history and had come across my dissertation, and having read everything on the subject, they thought that my dissertation was the best work that they had read on women's slavery. And they wanted to know if they could cite it. Scott also wanted to know what my publication plans were. I'm sorry, every time I haven't thought about this for a while. She read for W.W. Norton, Fifth Avenue Publishing Company. And she volunteered to take it to Norton if I hadn't found a publisher yet. The rest is, shall we say, history. To return to my theme, matter out of place, a gendered approach to slavery, and aren't I a woman, was such matter out of place that even the Library of Congress did not know what to do with it. Now, you know, every book that is published goes to the Library of Congress, and they index it and they give it an index number, etc. As reported by Leslie Schwam in a paper she presented at the 2003 Southern Historical Association, prior to the publication of Aren't I a Woman, quote, neither historians nor their students could have used the most basic research tool in the library, the card catalog, to gain direct access to information about women in slavery, unquote. As reported to Schwam by Sheridan Henry, who is the reference librarian at the Library of Congress, when Aren't I a Woman arrived with no place to go, a subject cataloger proposed on February 13th, 1985, that the heading Women Slaves be established by the Library of Congress. The heading was approved by the subject editorial meeting on March 5th of 1985, and books about female slaves were recatalogued under the new heading. Finally, this particular matter had found a place. And I can say, as I stand here today, that I too have found a place, and so has the history of African American women. Thank you. I will say this, that it has always been the case that African American families wanted to educate their girls even more so than their boys. And this had nothing to do with men being more threatening, etc. It was just that for African American families, and I'm talking about from the Civil War all the way to the present, women, as you know, the job market, or the kinds of work that women can do and the kind of jobs that women can get has always been very limited. Up until the 1970s, basically women were, you could be a teacher, a social worker, or a nurse, and limited to pink collar work. That wasn't even the case for black women. because for most of the 20th century and the late 19th century, most black women could only get jobs doing domestic work. I mean, this is where you find that even black women who were university trained often had to supplement their income by doing housework. So, and then once you do housework, you are subject to the sexual exploitation, not to mention the fact that it's just drudgery. You know, you didn't always have washing machines, and you didn't always have, gas or electric stoves. But besides that, so if a family could send one child, say, to school, they would choose the daughter as opposed to the guy. The guy could get some sort of manual labor work, but in order to keep black girls out of the households of white families, particularly given the threat of sexual assault, they would choose the girl. And it's called, there's a word for it, it's called the farmer's daughter effect. And so, I mean, when a person like Daniel Patrick Moynihan saw this in 1965, and when it was seen afterwards, it was sort of, well, you see, they like their daughters more than they like their guys, and the black family is matriarchal. No, black families generally always took it upon themselves to try to protect girls from household work, because that was basically the kind of work black women, if white women couldn't get but a limited number of jobs, that was not going to be the case historically for black women. So all I can say to answer your question, I'm not a sociologist, but I could just say that given also, let's talk about issues of mass incarceration of African American men, so that black women have had to take up so much of the burden of supporting the black family. It doesn't surprise me that you would find more black women trying to get educated, because there is, such an assault. Not that black women are also not the largest growing population in jails, but there are all these kinds of reasons, but there is a historical reason for that being the case as well. That's another huge question, but I agree. I mean, I don't think that you can understand American history without understanding African American history. And basically, a white historian by the name of Edmund Morgan once wrote a very seminal work called American Slavery, American Freedom. American freedom is based on American slavery. And that was the way it was from the 1600s. So, in order for white people to be free, somebody had to do all of the work. And if you look at as freedom increased in America, and when I say freedom, the right to vote, the right to own property and to obtain property cheaply, the right to make money, somebody had to be exploited. And the people who were exploited traditionally, and there are other people certainly now, but that tended to be African Americans. So I would agree. We like to go back and talk about, well, when America was great, and people like to go back to the 1950s, but even you can't understand the 1950s without understanding what was going on with African Americans. Yeah. I think that for so long we have assumed that white people have no historical bias when they write history. You have a whole school of history called the Dunning School, which was written at the very beginning of the 20th century. And, where there you have people like Ulrich B. Phillips, who's saying in his book, American Plantation Slavery, where he argues that there was no racism in America and that the slaves were happy and that everything was hunky-dory on plantations. But nobody ever questioned his particular bias. I will say this. I think that the historical profession, because of intersectionality, has changed. there used to be this idea that, historians could just be totally objective. And now we've moved. You understand that, we're still trained to be objective. But let's face it, I grew up on the west side of Manhattan in a housing project as poor. There's no way that somehow when I'm reading the history that I'm not somehow affected by that. And as a white male, if you were a historian, say you grew up where I went to college. I don't know. Are you a New Yorker? Yeah. Okay. So you're. Yeah. So you're. What we understand right now is that everybody brings a perspective. You have to try to overcome it. You must try to bring both everything to the table. And I may as well plug my most recent book is called Lost in the USA. And there's a chapter in it on white Christian men. Somebody once said to me, "You seem awfully objective." I'm like, I'm trained as a historian. But I nevertheless am going to bring my, everything about my background is going, when I look at these sources, I can't erase that, and neither can a white male, a white woman, or a Hispanic person. When you're doing the history, you bring everything about your being to it. And actually, it is made for so much better history. Well, I don't know if it's compared to other countries, because you would have to give me a one-to-one comparison, because there are societies now where the civil rights of many people are being violated. One only needs to look at the Middle East, and depending on what side you're on, one could look at Eastern Europe, and depending on, what side you are on, even in the Ukraine, say. So it depends. But I would say that, at least in the American context, it is because we don't want to acknowledge the impact of race. I would, and when I say race, I sort of would also say race and gender too, because just think, women didn't get the right to vote until 20? But the reason I say, because I do think that race had such an impact on the way that women were treated. If you're going to put one group of women up on a pedestal and say, you can't come down, well, why can't they come down? What are you afraid of? And if you look at the history, I teach a course called The History of Race and Sex in America, a lot of the fear of women coming down off of the pedestal would be that women, particularly white women, because they give birth to the next generation, a lot of that fear was, we can't have them in a multiracial society running around having anything but white babies. Now that may seem a little far-fetched to you, but I can go back to the laws of 1660 and quote chapter and verse where they actually put that into the laws. Am I right? People like me staying in it and not disappearing. That's number one. But I think that this also came from a grassroots movement. It actually came from the students who were on campus who said, this is what we want. From women on campus and saying, we demand these kinds of classes. We want to see ourselves in the history text. I'm listening to the radio this morning and I'm hearing about this movie that is about to come out, the Black Panther. Right, and everyone is saying, well, it's about time, because people want to see them, superheroes. Black people want to be superheroes too. But you had students on campus who were demonstrating, saying, we want this kind of history. And they tended, what happened is that, is particularly as women went on campuses, because it was with affirmative action that the number of women increased on college campuses. And as they went to these campuses, they said, we want to see ourselves. In the same way we have LGBT history now. It's like, we've always been here. So let's get with it. And then when the students start saying that, then us historians start, used to start, somebody said, LBGTQ. Maybe that passage that I saw in this guy's diary, maybe that had more to do, let me go back and read that again. So what happens is that then as you look at your sources, you start to see things that you didn't see before. Now, African American history, women's history, LGBTQ history, even now we have disability studies. I mean, people, it is absolutely amazing. It has made for the most vibrant field. It's far more vibrant than it, at least in my opinion, than it ever has been. And it's not like anybody lost their job. In fact, by expanding all of these areas of study, not only have you made room for people like me and women and African Americans and LGBTQ people, but most of this history is still being written by white men. So, it has been good for everybody. It's like not like anybody has lost anything in the expansion of both the academy and the historical profession and in what we study. Yeah. I've got a new project now, and I'm writing an autobiography, because both my parents were migrants. They came, one from Alabama, one from South Carolina. And so there's so many parts to that history. In my own particular case, and somebody has told me this before, so I'm quoting, there were a couple of things. One, I was smart. And my brother actually was a genius. He was he's passed away. He was a member of Mensa. So I was the also ran in the households, because sometimes birth order does make a difference, and I was always trying to catch up with him. So I was smart enough to sort of stay close, but when everybody was praising him, and I was sort of like, how about me? And I think I was able to take that into, it's like, all right, so Deborah, you're not that smart, but, because you're not like your brother. But, and I was sort of used to that. So I was used to having to just keep, the also ran. That's number one. Two, I grew up on the west side of Manhattan. I grew up in the Amsterdam Projects, which is right behind Lincoln Center. So I didn't grow up, and when I grew up there, it was very integrated. So unlike some people, it wasn't like I was thrown in to a white environment and got culture shock right away. I grew up one chapter that I'm going to write is how I became a Presbyterian, because they tore down my Baptist church when they built Lincoln Center. All right, and then I went to AME. Well, they tore that down too. The only church in the neighborhood that was left was a Presbyterian church, and we had a sister synagogue, and we had all faith congregational meetings, etc. So I grew up in a very integrated space. So when I went to college, and I was like one of 10 people. 10 black people on a college campus in Binghamton, New York. I mean, it was long. I guess I was also a person who was always used to being the only one. And while it bothered me, and it bothered me tremendously, I learned very early how to navigate that space. No, I never embraced it. I mean that. I did not embrace it. I just learned how to navigate it, because now I belong to a Black Baptist church. Yeah, every time I get to have a predominantly Black environment, I go there because I am so frequently the only one, and it gets to be tiring. It is, if you know, it is one of the most vibrant fields, and yeah, as a sort of, you know, as one of the very first in the sort of so-called modern era, we just keep getting more and more and more studies. It is absolutely incredible. It has also changed the way that we look at all other histories. So it is burgeoning, it is growing, it is, yeah. It is great. It really is. Yeah. So here's what I'd say, and I believe this, you know, like I said, I was smart, not as smart as my brother, not as smart. But that's not really what did it. It's something about being persevering. And I've seen it because now I have a very long history of teaching. And I've always taught at public institutions. I'm now at Rutgers University. I was at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. I have worked with high school students, and I'll tell you, for every person who is just of average intelligence, and how people decide that, I'm just still not sure, because my SAT scores were in the toilet. Really, they were. I just, you know, and a lot of people just can't take standardized tests. And so how you determine that. But I will tell you this, the person who's willing to do it over and over and over and over again is the person who's going to succeed. And I don't care, you can be sitting next to a person who's got an IQ of, you know, off the charts. But sometimes people, you know, really, really smart people can't function with ordinary people. You know, they really can't. And if you don't have that stick-to-itiveness, that no matter what, I am going to do it again. And I have students who, PhD students, and I give them back the dissertation, and I'm like, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do that. And, you know, they don't know that, yeah, I know how to do social media. They are cursing me out on social media. This is not smart. It really isn't. Like, you know, I don't know how to tweet, or I don't read it, I don't tweet, but I know, you know, the thing is, you have got to be willing to take criticism, and you've got to be willing to just do it again. Somebody says, no, that's not good enough, go home, do it again. That's what my colleagues told me, my female colleagues told me, just fix it, put it in another envelope. The rejection, somebody's gonna take it, and somebody took it. And this book has not gone out of print. It is still paying me royalties. This book was written in 1985. I'm actually and so much more has been written. You know, if I were to give a talk on Black women in slavery, we have learned so much more. But nevertheless, that's what I would say. You just do it again. The professor gives you a grade and gives you the chance, go beg. Don't email. No, really, seriously. Go stand in front of them and beg if you have to, and say, I'll do it again. Give me another chance, and then do it. And if it takes staying up all night long and, you know, pulling how many all-nighters, do it. That's the way you will succeed. And like I said, I will take perseverance over smarts any day.